Start. Okay. Um, so Jen is going to screen share tonight. Jennifer Sperry Steinorth's books include her read, A Graphic Poem 2021, and Awake with Nine Shades 2019, which was a finalist for the Forward Review's Prize for Poetry. They're both from Texas Review Press. A poet, educator, interdisciplinary artist, and licensed builder, she has received grants from Vermont Studio Center, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the MFA for Writers at Warren Wilson College. She teaches at Northwestern Michigan College and sometimes at the Hudson Valley Writers Center. Her read, A Graphic Poem, is a hybrid text at once poetry and visual art. In the tradition of reusing canvases, she takes a seminal text, The Meaning of Art by Herbert Reed, and with the liberal use of correction fluid, scalpel, and embroidery floss, transforms the book from art criticism into feminist verse. Though the maternal body appears with frequency in Reed's illustrated text, which spans from prehistory to the modern age, he includes 0 female artists. Her read, A Graphic Poem, is an excavation of buried voices, a reclamation of bodies framed in guilt, and an homage to those whose arts remain unsung. Please help me welcome Jennifer Sperry Steinorth.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you to the Hudson Valley Writers Center and to Kerrin and to Angela. I'm so thrilled to be reading with you. We are all graduates of the Warren Wilson MFA program. That's something that we share in common. And I think we're all reading from our second full-length collection. Correct me if I have that wrong. I'm actually coming to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm teaching at the University of Michigan, and now my bio's changed a little bit, so I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited to be here at Hudson Valley and to be in Ann Arbor. Thank you for that introduction. I have less to say about this book, except I do want to mention that I started this work in 2016, too enraged to write in the traditional sense, seeing, like so many of us, the ways that things that were moving in the socio-political sphere were resonate with things that were deeply personal and impactful and had been ongoing in my life for my life. And so I began this erasure project. I want to mention that some of the things that there are some characters that come up in this text that is all found text. I set about to deconstruct this one particular work, The Meaning of Art by Herbert Reed, first published in 1931. And in 1951, the third edition is the edition that I worked with, and contains one female artist appears in the third edition. The Virgin shows up a lot, as she does in art. And by Virgin, I mean the Christian iconic figure, Mother of Christ. And so one of the things I was really thinking about is the way that for women to enter the art world, for what history we have, was almost predominantly as an object of love or desire or maternity. And so that's something that comes up a lot, this relationship as the lover mother. With that, I'll just screen share and get right to it. I'm going to read beginning from the beginning of the text and go working my way all the way through the end. For the most part, I won't tell you when I'm skipping. If you scrutinize the screen, you could tell with page numbers. But so this is kind of a quilt, if you will, of patches of the work. Face this book as a road or passage from what is. I hope, for the sake of completeness, with the listener, In the present, I make for clarity and resurrect Francesca. On the left is the list of the all of the artists who appear and in there who have illustrations in the text. The imp is, properly speaking, what is common to all the arts, is the best starting point of our inquiry. Only the free create the imp. Any man responds to a pleasurable discomfort. The opposite of I is equally rare. I have already a theory of imp beauty, native to my own fluctuating phenomenon, manifest in the course of history, uncertain and often baffling his own sense of beauty, to admit the realm of other. Is negation of at the bottom of acute pain? We look often imply absurd. I derived from a flood. I rose in ancient Greece and was the offspring of a particular Apollo or Aphrodite, perfectly formed, perfectly proportioned, revived at the Renaissance. Still, I differs from the I ideal. I differs from the face in the mirror. Not a crystal, but a flower, fineness freed. We must not be afraid of pain. We must not be afraid of escape, for youth nowise is the measure of all things, and doubt is pain, pain is faithful. And I, the lovely lace ruff which adorns him. But actually we do make such a sensuous impression of vitality that a man sees and feels the object, sees its universal imp, sees the one in many, the many in one, at his peril. I remember a pain that he called fine, from which ivory, bone, silk, wool, Paris. The ass is his especial cathedral, conceived as walls enclosing a space, and as such must be viewed from within, or as a face defining a mass, and as such must be looked at from without. If we mind his rose and passage his child, amusingly he relates how pain is in the hands of a master. Even Leonardo had to touch my whole open window, as it has been called, with his manual dexterity and his scientific aim at feeling me not in control of his effects. He ran. O heart, O human continent, come hither, come nearer, the imp comes too. O wide sea, O soil, O story, O doubt, O flood, O river, O rope, I come to elope with this tomb, an intimate, romantic interlude, finally rid of Mr. Step and Mr. Gas and their fancy texts of the second coming. Except to suffer amour is splendid. Its innumerable domes and minarets and the extraordinary refinement of its ornament. Can be never deprived of that power, power to birth myriad selves, over which stretch the skins of human terror. Sadism is intense. Myth and folklore, fairy tales and horror, we know too little, too much about our own righteous dog. I practice a disinterested appreciation, a state of passive receptiveness, as Roger Fry called it, and so find endless pleasure. We know a flue penetrates eye. We know an ohm stretching from island through to the Renaissance. Oh, we come to be mother, other, other, as ever mother we conceive. Hand of my mom, mi mum, madre, ma mère, mama, mama, soft, sin word, strange, uncontent to remain outside. But softly we hum, feeling worser and worser, slowly learning our mum's genius is buried in the cellar. Thirst is a discipline of color, of pain, a brush, a brush, a brush, and years of rain. Thirst is author and judge of mother. It makes, then, passes through her fingers. Ink every vulgar mother whole story. A sung story conceives a story. Please let us refashion the story. I may suggest love is a professor, two round arches crossing a vault. The vault suggests great height, which in turn involves the buttress, a buttress, the pinnacle, and so on. But that does not explain the overwhelm that meets you as you enter me, your feelings roused by no solution of engineering. How we spoke one language, subterranean masters, indulging fancies between thinks. Go to, it was Never Neverland, a dynasty of dumb grace we could not escape, middle age, intact. If I describe sweetness, leaves, tendrils, flowers, animals, children, as a dreadful and vindictive plague, let that be a plea for intimacy, as ever love's voice is borrowed. Oh, I was so in, oh, in. Oh, virgin, with the lust of angels and curs, at beloved's behest, I played thee. Masters say pain is dominated by the whip of longing. Masters say pain is the dominion of ecstasy. Masters say pain is a dominatrix, is Italian. Say love in italics, apply hot wax. Sweet boy, this is a process can only be described as loving care. Comes lowliness, comes surprise, comes in a hood, in a van, in a cot. Act natural, frond of fern, petal of flower, lowly, the highest expression of sainthood, sweet, head tumbling out, a van, a cot, my mouth. Let's all pose for St. Francis. The landscape expects to consort with ecstasy. Pull back your hood, pull back my head. The dead is no actual person, cries, Master, master, read me top to bottom. Master, master, read me under the covers. Master me over the others, bottom to top, bottoms up. Let's all drink the virgin. Master, sweet master, peace me. Let me drink you under the table, spread like butter, wear my thigh. There but for a white, unmarked van go I, but for the grace of a waxworks saint. Oh, oh, you found my stigmata. Mister, I am not your masterpiece. Darling, you're my very best virgin. Don't you know, if pain be real, the best virgins are the ones who play pretend? Between the virgin and me, flesh can only be discovered by ship. I scarcely fret the waves at the foot of our fantastic fur bed. And still we cannot speak. Why, her silence with its dark and overnourished forms must be a tinkling of bells, graceful and fugitive. Deal, 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 no, 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 no. The tomb has windows, a shadow relief. If you are erased, if the hand you see in the stone remains buried, if you dare to be no man's hotel, limitations are obvious. He, his he, compose he of the he from the he before him, his subjects given him by his he. One may tremble to conceive such a Superman. For to part his he from he pains and pains her, he and his, I medium, weep. His eye, the whole canvas, our eye waters, closing to attend. what under and under the troubling sings. Of lake, the lake of the lake we make of she. So I'm skipping forward a fair bit, and at this point, I begin to take scalpel to word and excise them. I think of this as the speaker gaining agency over the materials, being able to more radically deconstruct them. And I should say that as I started cutting some pages out and deciding I wasn't going to use them intact in the book, I began to think of those pages that I removed as dead pages that I would mine for parts. And that made me start to think about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and the idea of digging, this idea of excavating the dead, and also physically in the form of the material, excavating from the dead and using the parts. And Frankenstein makes an appearance at the end here. The novel. The costume into which we are born is old-fashioned. In the blue of war, over yellow roads, in cities on stage in plastic wards, bare-faced and desert-shorn, we have born masters. No memory of an unborn master. Yet must we be born one or the other? Could we be neither and wonder? Or is there ever a king in speaking, one who proclaims, I pain what I see? In his book, he who transforms the sun transforms into the sun, who we, child, must admire. O dears, O fathers, so late in the day, still ashamed of pain, ashamed of the world in pain. So we are made in pain to pose and shimmer. O world of fiddlers in a tower of dilated suns, laboring to appease demons. O demon world, O world of imp of mousetraps and moon, memory and muchness, and mouths. O birth of our artist I. The cost is disgust, but on the other hand, disgust. O utterance of abject body, help us connect with others, with doctors and holders of pain. In pain, sweating change, confined to ourselves, our terror. For shame is born a master child son of war, a pulsing laboratory with its own official flora and fauna. Mind child, mind not our professors of shame, their fine nervous lines, their rank religious fantasy. To love yourself is no lunacy, or if lunatic it be, give us the key to the lunatics. Theirs is the only music. Over a harp, out of a lute, naked, wounded, a bird-headed corpse stoops. Perhaps we should all be lunatic, living in blue-green provinces. We might return to the burying ground, dig deep and sing our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother's blues. Let us sing their bitter fruit. This is my body broken for you. But enough of sacrifice. Perhaps we are too fragile. Let us discuss the line of our new lady's shoe. I want only to think of a great lady's shoe. Accents of such individuality, of almost endless variety, the shoe, not green memory residues. A human being drifts through time like an iceberg, only it will not carry us far. So let me dispense with sentimental speculation, moody exaggeration, and attempts to reclaim our lost art, cutting apart what is great to mourn our lost art. Perhaps I have only to appreciate the applied arts, which create a psychological document. For still we paint our faces. Still we cut ourselves in private places. We eat too much or we do not eat, and all have been ill. Becoming a portrait to wed, becoming as a mirror to wed, a slip of self reflected in a fountain. For what is the self left in the clay? The world, Venus, the end, delicate, a ship, wine, wonder, the cave, glory, longing, truth, folly, ornament, piety, mystery, grace. I'm not going to answer that question. Another country are possible. We know the mind is stored with countless records of past which may, when struck, surface again in color, having been hidden so long from light. And in various countries, in the soil, in every part of the world, we find an intimate, another eye moves. We have only to ask, only to answer. This is my body breaking for you. In this book, to get many of the mays had to be restructured, and the imps freed from impressionist impressions, and from painters, paintings, and paints came our pain. In this book, every she is a construct, a remodel, a reconstruction, a symbol born of destruction. Likewise, each her derives from here and there, where and whether, either, rather, and other, and on the other hand becomes her hand, floating above her hand. Oh, her hands, a stone, this branch, hand in hand by her own hand, she is becoming. And yet, by my own hands and this raw biopsy, I confess a few she's carving or cutting does not satisfy. No, not when there are others we have yet to see, to hear. Oh, love, would you would add your own mark here and every otherwhere. For alas, we have long been surgeons, remodeling vital organs, cutting away at life as if we might recover the dead, arousing with fantasies of reformities. Does the new pain differ from the old? Like wind and water, must every eye be explored, tree and branch, lake and blood, otter, roach, cosmos? Behold, instead of mother and child, I offer up Frankenstein's portrait. Dearly begotten son of Mary, old Frank might say, this is my body, Baroque, yo. The monumentality she achieves with her grave technique, her cutting and piecing, is apparent in the manner her mind-child conceived becomes three, part sculpture, part theater, part hospital. Oh, Mr. Reed, touch me where I bleed. Put your sensitive hands in the wound. We are great reservoirs, and this portrait, a performance, an eye refrain, casting light and shade. Baby, this is our offspring. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was incredible. And thank you so much for sharing your screen so we could see that. And Sophia is going to put information in the chat so everyone can find out where you can buy this wonderful book. As you know, it's hard to launch books during the pandemic. So please do support your fellow poets during this difficult time. Thank you so much, Jen. Now we're going to hear from Angela Narciso Torres. She is the author of What Happens Is Neither, Four-Way Books 2021. Blood Orange, winner of the 2013 Willow Books Literature Award for Poetry, and the chapbook To the Bone from Sundress Publications in 2020. Another graduate of Warren Wilson MFA program for writers and Harvard Graduate School of Education, Angela has received fellowships from Breadloaf Writers Conference, Illinois Arts Council, and the Ragdale Foundation. She received first prize in the Yates Poetry Prize, and New City Magazine named her as one of Chicago's Lit 50 who really books in Chicago. Born in Brooklyn and raised in Manila, she currently resides in San Diego. She serves as a senior and reviews editor for Rhino Poetry. Tim Siebels writes, in What Happens is Neither, Angela Narciso Torres has jimmied the lock to a house of intricate family memory and sumptuous wisdom. These are poems of intense reflection and loss, but also of rediscovery and delight. As the years pass and one becomes overwhelmed by what is remembered and all that has been forgotten, such poems might restore the balance that allows us to live with and beyond that loud clanging in the heart. Please help me welcome my pressmate, Angela Narciso Torres.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for having us tonight. And thank you to the Writers Center, beloved by so many in this community, for the warm welcome. Thanks to each of you for joining us tonight. I'm just so grateful to be celebrating with Kerrin and Jen today, because as you've heard, all our books were pandemic babies. And What Happens is Neither came out almost exactly a year ago. So this is literally her first birthday. So Jen, I want to especially say thank you for that brilliant reading. I'm still trying to catch my breath after having read you and heard you read it and having seen those brilliant images on screen. And I was just so moved by how you talked about trying to find the materials to express your anger and refashioning the story using erasure, but not just erasure, also cutting and digging and reusing and really putting agency into the process of retelling the narrative of women's role in art. In some way, my book is a refashioning of a life after loss. I wrote it after my parents passed away 2 years ago, 11 days apart from each other. And it was written originally as an homage and an elegy to their lives, but also later I found out, a year later, having read from the book over the past year on Zoom, like we're doing tonight, that really many of the poems I'd been writing were also preparation for the many losses that would ensue in the past year and a half during the pandemic. So I'm learning a lot from this book, the more I read from it, that all the ways that we, try to refashion our grief into art can help us with all the losses that are yet to come. So in a sense, like we saw with Jen's reading, art is a way to refashion and retell our narratives. And it's really vital in healing both old and new wounds. So in her tradition, I guess I'll start with a cento, a poem that borrows lines and excises them from 3 other pressmates of mine that aren't here tonight, but will be with us in spirit: John Murillo, Yona Harvey, and Julia Goes, all from Four-Way Books. I wrote this cento as a way of processing loss. Sometimes your own words aren't enough. So every line in this poem is from one of those poets. I didn't include any of my words. The Loss Variations, a cento pantoum using lines from John Murillo, Julia Goes, and Yona Harvey. Start with loss, lose everything, then lose it all again. Dust, algebra, fire. Like a high yellow sadness, this will be one weaning after another. Dust, algebra, fire. The slightest mistake could bring disaster. This will be one weaning after another, stained with rosaries and skeletons. The slightest mistake could bring disaster. A candle, a straight pin, a slave owner's sins, stained with rosaries and skeletons, curved in prayer or remembrance of hurt. A candle, a straight pin, a slave owner's sins. Please come closer. Take this from my hand, curved in prayer or remembrance of hurt. Any launch changes everything. Please come closer. Take this from my hand. I came here to live. Any launch changes everything. Pearl, pollen, salt. I came here to live. Dawn again. And this is what we wake to. Pearl, pollen, and salt. Enough gentleness and humor to go on. Dawn again. And this is what we wake to. A high yellow sadness. Enough gentleness and humor to go on. Start with loss. Lose everything, then lose it all again. I like the Pantoum because of the repetitive nature of it and how, it really speaks to our obsessions when we're grieving or when we're going through a period of mourning. And indeed, the rituals and chants of ancient shamans in every culture used that kind of poetry, if you will, as part of the ancient art of healing. In one of the poems in my book, I used the wise adages and sayings of my mother that I heard from her and her sisters and her ancestors through the years growing up. They somehow floated back to me, and though they made no sense in their logical world, there was comfort to repeating this wisdom that gave a kind of sense, kind of order to the world, to their world. This is if you go to bed hungry. If you go to bed hungry, your soul will get up and steal cold rice from the pot. Stop playing with fire before the moon rises, or you'll pee in your sleep. Sweeping the floor after dark sweeps wealth and good fortune out the door. Fork dropped, a gentleman will visit. Spoon, a bashful lady. Bathing after you've cooked over a hot stove makes the veins swell. For safe passage to the guest who leaves mid-meal, turn your plate. The adage goes, coffee stunts growth. 12 grapes on New Year's, the opposite. Advice from the learned, book under your pillow. Never step on, never drop. Every rice grain that remains on your plate, you'll meet again on the footpath to heaven. You'll have to stoop to pick up each one. So many of these poems I wrote even as my mother was gradually losing her memory to Alzheimer's. And I discovered poetry as a way of finding out what we didn't lose, her bits of advice, her favorite perfume, her recipes, catchphrases that she would say at dinner, her piano playing. This is Sundowning for my mother, Carmen. The sweetest meat clings to the bone, my mother says, knifing her steak. Carmen, silver spade on my tongue. Mahjong nights, her mother and father gone, she cried herself to sleep, blamed in the morning for her mother's unlucky hand. The sweetest meat, she begins at dinner, tearing off a drumstick. What will she recall by morning? Named for Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she pinned brown scapulars under our shirts, wet stamps that cleaved to our backs. Carmen, prayer on the breath. Amid potted ferns, she works a jigsaw puzzle, Bizet on the radio. Unable to sleep, she made me lie next to her. My brothers clambered the banyan trees. My legs twitched, a broken clock. Her kisses are guava and rust. She sings kundimans her mother sang, Sampaguita, dahil sa'yo. Sunday morning, puzzle pieces strewn on yesterday's news. Maria Callas on the phonograph. Carmen, citrine fire. When she plays the piano, the lovebirds fall silent. Alabaster eggs tremble in glass bowls. Afternoons, she woke with an urge to bite the brown loaf of my arm. The marks on my flesh faded by sundown. The sweetest meat clings, she insists, peels a mango. Amber rivers trace her elbows. A trail of l'air du temps wafts in her wake. I follow it to her room, dab the scent on my wrists and throat. Evenings, she sang Kundimans, Hating Gabi, Nasaan Ka Ilog, Carmen, Song of the Mangosteen Moon. Before you go, I want to give you something. She hands me a thimble painted with a map of Cuba. We've never been to Cuba. In the dream, a sister pours rosary beads into her cupped hands. Upon waking, a dead wasp curled in her palm. In this book, I wrote several self-portraits, and as part of my effort to, again, reconstruct, reinvent the self, to answer the question, how does one remake a sense of integrity after loss? And one thing that's been really helpful for me and has been, it's a buzzword we hear every day, self-care, but really it's a form of ritualistic healing when we care for ourselves in any small way. And one of my favorite ways of self-care is taking a bath, which for me is like an instant reboot, no matter what kind of a day you're having. This is self-portrait as water. Why does the body feel more beautiful underwater? Is what goes through me when I break the glass surface. Levels rising as I plumb the tub's white womb, this second skin thinner, slicker, gleaming wet as a lacquered bowl. Because the simplest of molecules, 2 H's, 1 O, love to love each other, cling to what they touch. How this universal solvent swallows every hill, fills the hollows of my surrender. Most forgiving of substances, I resolve to live like you, to fill and be filled, to take the shape of my vessel, dispensing heat, displacing matter, lighter than air. Another thing that I discovered during the pandemic, the mundane act of doing chores can be elevated almost to the level of the sacred when performed with purpose and full attention. This poem is Chore. My friend can turn anything into prayer, sweeping the leaves, shaving his beard, washing dishes, every act a purging of what doesn't serve. Today, I'm folding laundry. I start with jeans, crisp from the dryer, smoothing the creases, then draping them on wooden hangers. Shaking wrinkles from the sheets, I square the corners the way mother taught. White t-shirts stacked flat on a shelf, sundresses on felt hangers, sweaters nestled in drawers. I find a place for every blouse, every scarf until it feels inevitable. Order our days, the remnant floats up from decades of Sundays like words of a forgotten song. In your peace. My mantra, fold, hang, repeat, the hamper half empty, the bureau warm with balled up socks. Let's see, looks like I have about 5 minutes left. I'll read maybe 2 more poems. This next short poem I wrote, one of the few poems I wrote after my father passed away that made it into this book. And I think part of rituals are objects that for us hold a special value. And for me, that object, that talisman, was my father's violin, which was one of the last things I brought home to the States from our house in Manila. Yeah, he played the violin and my mother accompanied her. And after my mother died, I accompanied him. So that was one of our rituals when I'd go home, was to play music with him, which always delighted my mother. Last. 4 days after the funeral, I carry my father's violin in its long brown box. Sturdy, rectangular, built to last. In airport security, its round shoulders glide through plastic, swallowed by dark. It emerges beneath harsh light. It's September when I raise the lid, brush dust from the mute veneer he touched last spring, anointing a stuck peg, sliding rosin on the bow. I remember the A string wouldn't tune. He played anyway. His body leaned and swayed in its wheelchair cage. I remember how the bows strained. Okay, the last poem I'll read is not in the book. It's a poem I wrote on my mother's birthday, her first birthday away from us. And I realized, that it's notoriously difficult for people who've lost loved ones to celebrate anniversaries, but one way we get through them is by making new rituals. And one way I've discovered really helps me is to, wear my mom's cologne, wears a bit of jewelry that she used to wear. And in this case of this poem, I wore her silk kaftan on her birthday, and it really made me feel her presence. The way objects, talismans imbue us with some sort of spiritual grace or presence. This is grapefruit. Cutting through the equator of a grapefruit, the blade sinks into pink pulp. A day like any other. Warm gusts when I let the dog out. 13th of September, mother's birthday. Gone 4 moons. I slip into her kaftan of orchids and zebras, brew manzanilla tea. I walk in a cloud of her Spanish cologne. Notes of bitter orange recall the day she birthed my brother. We are born, we die. In between, the slicing and sharing of fruit, the scent of someone's hair, the sowing of seeds, the climbing of many steps, a newborn mewling in your bare arms. Thank you so much.
So beautiful, Angela. Do you have one more poem for us? We have a request for one last poem. Your time flew by very quickly, people have been saying.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'll read the title poem from the book, What Happens Is Neither. Thank you for that request. I'm honored and flattered. What happens is neither the sorry, I'm a little choked up here. Okay. In this titular poem of the book, it's the first line is also partly the title of the poem. So I'll just go through it. What happens is neither the end nor the beginning, yet we're wired to look for signs. Consider the peonies. One makes a perfect bud after months of nothing. Another's leaves are ringed with black rot. How can I not think end? How can I not say beginning? Leaves fall when days shorten because a tree must reduce to its tough parts, twig, branch, bark. My mother sleeps away the daylight. She nods off while chewing a spoonful of fish and rice. Her head a peony gone to seed. Father calls to say she doesn't recognize him. Turning to him, she cried out, certain a stranger was in her bed. He played his violin till she slept, a leaf in late fall curling into itself. In autumn, chlorophyll disappears, canceling green from leaves so yellow and magenta can blaze. In my mirror, I see her, the smile that favors a cheek, eyes slanting in the shape of small fish we eat for breakfast. Trees know best the now of things. What goes on has been going on for centuries. Washing dishes, I rest a foot on my standing leg. A fork clangs on the tile. I rinse a cracked cup. I try not to think of endings. Thanks again. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. I wish that Gilbert and Gubar were here from last week, because these feminist poets would make them very, very proud. Really, really gorgeous reading. Such a great night. Thank you all for being here. We are so lucky now that we're going to hear Kerrin. Okay. Kerrin McCadden is the author of Landscape with Plywood Silhouettes from New Issues in 2014, Keep This to Yourself, Button Poetry 2020, and most recently, American Wake, Black Sparrow Press 2021. Her first book won the inaugural Vermont Book Award in 2015, and American Wake was recently a finalist for the New England Book Award. A recent National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship awardee, her poems have appeared in Best American Poetry, Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, American Poetry Review, Beloit, and elsewhere. She teaches at Montpelier High School, serves as the Associate Director of the Conference on Poetry and Teaching at the Frost Place, and is the Associate Poetry Editor at Persea Books. She lives with her family in Vermont. Major Jackson writes, new from a poet whose astonishing images, emotional honesty, and storytelling power hold a singular clarity of vision, American Wake navigates loss with such unparalleled sensitivity and inventiveness that language becomes its own jubilant force of survival. Please, everyone, help me welcome Kerrin McCadden.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm also feeling emotional just from everything. This has been a really powerful evening. And I'm incredibly honored to be here. Thank you so much to the Hudson Valley Writers Center and to Jen and to Jen Sperry Steinorth and Angela for having this poetry party with me and us here together tonight. So I'm kind of speechless. So I'm going to read from my new book. It's American Wake, and it's a book that has 3 threads in it that weave together that all speak to the brokenness of homes and how we have to work to understand their disassemblement and how we put them back together. And every time I do a reading with other poets, I make a set list, what I'm going to read, and then given what I've heard, I'm like, oh, I should read that poem, oh, I should read that poem, just to respond to some of the work that I've heard. So it's always a really enlivening experience to try to figure out what to read. So this book weaves through the story of my family in Ireland. I'm a second-generation American. I'm an Irish citizen, and I was raised with no awareness of really what Ireland was like and where our family was. And my grandparents really wanted us to be American, so I spent a lot of time trying to find out where we were from, and ended up finding my grandparents' farms in Donegal, and have spent the last 10 years of my life going back and living with my cousin in his house, which is my grandfather's farm, where he farms sheep. And so this has been this incredible rediscovery of home for me, as well as learning the story of how the home sort of fell apart with emigration. So this book is about Ireland. Oh, I didn't even start my timer. Oh my goodness. Okay. Also about divorce and my own dissolution of my original marriage home, and then my brother died of an opioid overdose during the writing of this book and became a huge focus of the book. So there's these 3 different threads. So tonight I'm going to read mostly the poems about Ireland and reconnecting with Ireland, and especially because during the pandemic I can't go back, and I really miss my time there. And it's been ironic, I'll start reading in a second, but it's been ironic to me, not ironic, that's not the right word, I don't think, how I wrote this book about home and confronting loss and home, and then the pandemic happened, and then we were all stuck in our homes, confronting our homes. So this is a very kind of circular set of themes for me. I'll start with a poem called In the Harbor. In the harbor. I love the moment after buckling the seatbelt in a plane, headed God knows where, anywhere. How I know there is no way to do laundry, dishes, or fix a leak. Everything all fuck it back behind me on the ground once I've lifted off. Which I think is almost, but also nothing like that moment after the Aquitania has started moving. But first the smaller boat in the harbor, which maybe I am on with them when time happens again, starts to move out to sea. Last night we drank all night like I was the new dead one. The stories told again and again like prayers. When we are out to sea, We look back to see faces ringing the shore like a fence. Those we love in up to their hips in waves, waving goodbye like mad. It's a poem that was written based on an illustration of people in the water, a line drawing of people that was written contemporaneous with famine and people's departures from Ireland a long time ago, before my grandparents left. But just the idea people would go into the water for the last glance of the ship, is to stay as close to their loved ones as they could before they left. A very moving image to me. Our house behind the hawthorns. Up the lane, each house abandoned longer ago is deeper in bog moss and lichen. Our house is just stone walls, a box filled with rusted bed frames and plows, 11 children, 2 benches, a plank table, work and haul, kettle and hook, stick broom, dirt floor, turf light. At night, tiptoe the edges of 13 people sleeping. Come morning, the clouds are what moves, the magpie flashing like it is not afraid. The sheep say their words with their heads low, as if they know a story is a sacrament. What I came to learn: boxes have ways of folding that children can't know. The man I called, oh goodness sakes, would tell me nothing, signed the short song of his name with an X. My grandfather couldn't read and signed all his documents with an actual X. In Legany, Donegal. My little grandaunt had no coat, and it lashed rain in March on the way to school, and the schoolmaster at Four Masters saw her trouble and sent her to stand by the fire, and the cold little girl in the wet dress stood too long and dried the rain and caught fire, everyone running and patting her out. The degree of burns not anything that survives in this story. No other details, just the rain, no coat, the teacher, the fire patted out, the girl gone home to bed, the girl, the pain. And it was back then when she died, just like the cooper's wife gone missing, or the woman who was burned in a pile of tires down the road. A century later, gone, a fire, no cleansing, and nothing to do after but almost get lost in time. A woman I visit saying, no, I don't know anything about your family. No, wait, I do. The title poem for this book, American Wake, refers to a ritual in Irish culture where when someone was leaving to come to America, they would hold an actual wake, like in the tradition of the Irish wake, because it was Ireland and a wake. But it was for the person who was leaving. And the reason it was a wake was because they would never see the person again. There was no air travel. You know, my grandparents left in 1920 as adults, and they would never go home. I think they went back once in the 1970s, and it was a miserable trip. But the point was that people would expect to leave and never come back, so they would hold this ritual, and that's what this poem recounts. It begins with an epigraph from a song about emigration from Donegal, and the little lyric is, "The land is too small to serve all, and we must cross the sea." And if we're to get political, we'll know that that's actually not true. It was a much more nefarious political structure. American Wake. Hold a wake for the living, the leaving. Stop the clocks and turn the mirrors. Tell stories. Smoke and eat and drink. It was never a question of whether they'd leave, but when. Play games to pass the time, not to check that the dead are dead, but to lift a lesser God. Tell what you've heard about the new world. Later, all you will be able to tell is what you remember. Let the keener loose on the night. Let the house wail. Sing the songs. Let pipes keep evil at bay. Square off with your child and dance. Let the neighbors whose baby was born with a call lend it, a charm against drowning. Give dry cakes for the passage, a box of eggs. Roast frogs, grind them to a powder, and bake into bread to safeguard against fever. Take no shortcuts to the dock. This is it. The bees will tell the other world who's gone. And this is a poem about my grandfather called Longshoreman. He worked on the docks of Boston. Longshoreman, shoulder to the barrel, weather sturdy, the taste of the word wheelbarrow when you ask to borrow your neighbor's because you don't have one. See also rigor, horsepower, force of will against the barrel's will to object. Longshoreman, a thing to holler from deck to put men in line on shore. Alongshore, men, shape up, a thing to do to get hired, to wait in a clump in the morning to be hired, pie caps snapped, rolled pocketed, sweaters, wool pants, skin weather red, breath a kind of exhaust, a crowd of chimneys craning above morning, a pallet of grandfathers, ships exhaling, inhaling men and goods, their voices threading through foghorns and rigging, clanging like unregulated brokers, their eyes giving a go at the classifieds after work in an easy chair, grandmother in her chair nearby, negotiate sling loads, deal in dry goods, tally pallets, rope the stacks in place, hold steady, sheaves and sheaves, lock down goods in the ship's belly. Skip that one. And this is a poem I wrote on the tiniest of the Aran Islands in Ischir. I went on a trip with a friend and we came across a ruin. We thought it was a house and it was actually a very tiny church. And it's about the Saint Gobnet, who's the saint whose church it was from this, I think the 600s. She was there with her parish and her church. 9 white deer for Sarah. The sea forgives nothing on Inisheer, though I think it might, outnumbered as we are by stones and bees. The campanula suggesting stay, playing their purple bells in the wind. The cell and the church stand open to the sky like mouths, and what might be square tombs show their backs. Gobnet ran from her family's fighting to live here in a stone cell no bigger than a rowboat, underground next to her church. A church so small, we think it's a ruined cottage at first. Barely legible in the grass beside it, the stone outline of another room where the coffee and donuts were served. We laugh, shushed by a woman who points through the narrow door at a priest in white robes, his arms up as if to hold the sky, the church roof gone. We stand with our palms to the stones and listen, feeling the thinness, eyes welling. We are waved in, given a book, sound out words in Breton, and guess the melody of Heureux. Our textbook French barely a guide. Not even the carline thistle's gold readying us for the communion we take, the wine we share across time. Halfway back in time until Christ, a vision told Gobnet to leave this place, not to settle until she found a herd of 9 white deer. There she would find her resurrection place. I know how tired she must have been. A double hawthorn tree stands like a mother at the top of the meadow, shark fins and bird bones hung from her branches, skulls tucked in her elbows. I leave a shell at her feet with a prayer for my family, walk out past a square white stone covered in moss and broken shells, where the birds break snails for their meat. I'm going to make a swift left turn to reading a few poems about my brother to close out the evening. This poem is called Planetarium. I roam the antique shops in town to outfit our new house, bringing home 2 flying saucer lamps, a silver bracelet with a blank field for a name, and a vintage Nova Home planetarium to surprise you, thinking you would be someone who had one as a boy, and set it on the dresser in our bedroom, giddy to show you. I unpack a few boxes, poking around the house like an adventurer who doesn't believe in booby traps. My mother calls to say my brother has overdosed and is gone. Her voice is a long and terrible song that grows a crack in my chest, or my bones double. Our home becomes a replica of a home, twice as big as a place I can call home, then collapses flat. I make some necessary phone calls. Friends come to sit with me in pajamas and listen. That night in bed, I stare at the ceiling and tell you every story. I walk you back with me. I expand too. I want to know where he is, really, where. I have asked so many times now, where is gone? You get up as if to go to the bathroom or some other mundane, dark of night, glass of water chore, and I think, no, not now. But you turn on the planetarium and light up the sky so I can see where he is. There's a lot of references in this book to the moon and to outer space and imagined spaces and using Google Earth to find places and sort of underwater, up above, and how we navigate the planet. And I just mention that because this next poem also mentions the moon and the stars. Nixon, when he was getting ready to celebrate the moon landing, also had William Safire prepare a speech in case of a moon disaster. And so there's this beautiful speech that Nixon was prepared to give the nation if the moon landing was a disaster. And I took the poem, this is sort of an homage to Jen's work. I spent days with every single word from that speech on my desk, and I moved them around and moved them around. And I built this poem only out of words that were in the speech, and because my brother's loss felt like a moon landing disaster, it really felt like a life that was, I guess, akin to that kind of disaster. And this is this poem. It's called In Event of Moon Disaster, from Nixon's alternative speech in case of a failed moon landing, 1969, which was the year my brother was born. The mother should telephone the constellations to find her son. This is a burial at Moon Sea. Others to be will follow into the unknown, and whoever looks up at the moon prior to prayer will remain foremost in a state of undermending. There is no recovery for their hope. In ancient times, our heroes looked at stars and saw our hearts stirred in. Families should adopt this same procedure. Nights to come, the brother in the corner of another world will send for friends. They will stay on the moon to rest in peace. I think I can read, I had 5 minutes, 4 minutes. I think I can read one more poem. It's a sonnet, and it's, maybe I can squeeze in the last one too, we'll see. So this is another poem for my brother. It's called Weeks After My Brother Overdoses. And the title's a spilling title too, so I'll just say the whole thing with the title spilling into the poem. Weeks after my brother overdoses, I search Craigslist for sadness, a white couch the only result. Happiness lands red shipping containers, and that's it. I wander through days like an envelope marked, please forward. Listen, my brother is a ghost. I keep thinking I am not a sister anymore, though others assure me I still am. Just sister them, builders say, to make a thicker beam, or to span a distance. Join the faces of 2x6s with nails. Make more from less, make do. No one will let me have my sadness or tally what I've lost. I make lists like recipes for how to go on alone. I draw his death when I doodle, making little crime scenes, as if this epidemic were a murderer, a suspect, a criminal. I draw him on every sidewalk to inflate the numbers, to give my brother to everyone. Inside the outline, I do some math. I add him to 72,000 and subtract him from me. that would have been a good poem to end on, but I do have a little more time, so I'll just read the closing poem for the book. I wrote this poem home on holiday, and I was wrapping up the book sort of with the idea that I was a stranger in my new home in Ireland. I'd always thought of myself as Irish, not American, because it was such a big part of my childhood with my grandparents. And then going there, learning who I was. And much of this book is learning who you are when you lose something. Who am I now? Who am I now? I've lost this. Who am I now? This is called Home on Holiday in Lahey Village. A gas station clerk asks if I'm home on holiday when he hears my accent, flat as a stone in me, gone as long as I've been, forever I'd say, if home were a place I had ever been before. When he tries my accent dull as bone, then I think I know what he means, as if home were a place I had been before. I am a map of work and names from way back when. I finally understand what he means. I've been turned around. To find home, I worked my way back from a map of names. I rent a house where I'm home already, bring what I've found of me, what I thought was home in me, gone as long as I've been, forever it seems. I rent a home where I'm home already, begin at the gas station. I tell the clerk where I've been. Thank you.
Wow, what a gorgeous night of poetry. Thank you so much to the three of you. And really thank you to Jen for proposing this trio together, because even though you're all such different poets, your work speaks so well to each other. It was really a wonderful reading. Now we'd love to ask the three of you some questions from the audience. Sophia and I will take turns, but we like to start, as we always do, asking the three poets to talk a little bit about any advice that you would have to emerging poets in the room who are putting together their first collections, sometimes chapbooks, sometimes full length.
I'll say something. I really struggled with the structure of my book, and I think it's a really tough thing to figure out what a structure is, and there are all kinds of preconceived notions about how a collection should be structured in this sort of industry, like what's cool and what's stylish. But I think your poems can tell you the order that they want, and even if you are not doing it in a way that follows some kind of preconceived notion of what you think. So
I would say being patient, which sounds kind of lame, and which sounds patronizing maybe, but I would say that having, I guess this goes to the topic of structure, but having the poems and then figuring out how they speak to each other, and like finding the surprising connections, things that maybe feel like you're like, oh, that doesn't belong, that's not part of this. And I feel like it's like human work that takes more time than you think it should take. It's sometimes way more time than you think it should take. That was my experience on my first book.
I love both your answers. I'll say yes to both, but also I guess just trust your obsessions, trust what you feel most, you feel closest to in your writing, and trust that it will hang together in the final analysis, because you're writing from your lens with your sensibility. So no matter how divergent the poems might look, there's still you behind those poems. Yours is the lens that brings all these poems together. So when I was writing this last book, there were a lot of poems about my parents. There was about my family, and it was mostly about grief and loss. But in the process of going through all this grieving, and my mother, declining to Alzheimer's, life was going on. My sons were going off to college, and my marriage, I was getting older, and the body is starting to fail. And all of those are kinds of loss that we deal with. So yeah, it's writing your life, basically. As Jen said, be patient and trust that it will hold together because it's your story.
Just one comment about order that Kerrin was talking about. I read a lot of reviews of your books when I was reading your books, and I found one review of Kerrin's book very interesting, where at first the reviewer was very resistant to the way that you had braided the brother's death. And I thought it was very jarring to read that review and see, that kind of stance being taken after the book was, of course, already finished and published and out there. But at the end, was persuaded that this was, of course, the right way to order the book. But I always talk to my students about this. We have a lot of conversations about ordering and braiding and keeping sections together of the same thing. And for what it's worth, I think, you ordered it brilliantly, and the poems talk to each other so much. So I hope that was not something that bothered you when you
No,
saw that review.
I think he was also making the point that he had liked the brother poems alone in a chapbook. He was really fond of them together, which is what Keep This to Yourself is. It takes all of them and puts them in a chapbook. And so he read American Week after having appreciated the chapbook. So, and I really loved, his second review came out like 8 months after the first review, where he was reviewing his review and like saying, mea culpa, I was wrong. It was really a funny and wonderful
It was really funny, right?
retraction.
Yes, I liked seeing that. I think that's interesting and just really shows what Angela was saying. You have to stick to your guns. It's your work ultimately, and what you're trying to do, and you have a vision for it, and stand up for your vision. So I think that's this reading was a good example for students to see the different ways in which the three of you have done that. Sophia is going to ask the three of you a question now.
Yeah. Jennifer, you mentioned leaving room for the surprising connections, finding the surprising connections while in the process of writing a book. And we actually had a question in the chat for you specifically about what was the most surprising discovery of your process? Did you establish creative or formal rules for yourself at the outset of the project, and how did they change or surprise you as you went along?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I started off with some more traditional rules for erasure. I was just going to be using whiteout, the words in the order that they appear. I very quickly realized that because I was working with a piece of criticism, there was such a heavy amount of Latinate language, not very much Germanic, and not very. So then it was really lacking in nouns and verbs and concrete language. So I needed to make words out of what was there. So like the king in thinking, like that's actually the word king that lives inside of thinking, which I started to later in the book draw attention to my process. But or the pig and pigment, or that's where the imp came from. I mean, the imp actually appeared because, and that was a big surprising discovery. Ha! Imp, that impish imp that appears on the first page, because I really had hardly any nouns to work with. So things like that would happen constantly. I would be surprised, and a lot of the times that I broke a rule had to do with the fact that I suddenly saw. It's just like when you break a rule in a sonnet, right? You're like, I have to break this rule of meter or whatever it is that I'm doing, because suddenly something that has to be there And it's important enough to upset the rule, and in fact to draw the attention to the fact that it's now breaking the rule of what that has been established. And that would happen sort of over and over again. And then once the rule was broken, I would kind of often let it be broken.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful, enlightening answer. Angela and Kerrin, I wonder if you two would also like to speak to structure and making rules when you're at the start of your project and how they change as you go along.
Kerrin, do you want to go first?
I can, sure. I would talk a little bit about form, which might be a good connection to what Jen is saying. A lot of the poems, or a fair number of the poems, are sort of invented forms in my book, where I would make a rule for what the poem had to do. One of them is a dictionary definition. One of them is a choose your own adventure poem. Another, the one I read, was built from a speech. And I have one poem that the first stanza uses only, the second stanza uses only and exactly and precisely the words from the first stanza, rearranged to build a second stanza. So I really enjoy those games where you seek to control language, but what happens is language, something surprising emerges, right? The control element ends up creating surprise. And I love the term enabling constraints. So I often make a rule for myself when I start writing a poem that feels like a game. And then Lord knows what shows up, right? The wildness of the mind shows up. But I really enjoyed setting rules for individual poems and seeing what happened. And I still do it. Like, I collect words. I'm collecting words and images right now. And I don't know what the poem will be, but I know I want these things to be together. So I'm constantly doing that kind of work.
I guess for me, I'll speak also to the subject of form in poetry. I've always felt that form is a way of liberating our creative expression. And I love the quote from Henri Cole that poetry is like a genie in a bottle. The bottle only makes the genie stronger. So when I'm stuck, I will usually write in form, like the pantoum or sonnet, or even the golden shovel, where you're given a lattice or a kind of like a template with the last words already taken from someone else and put down the right side of the page. And then you write to those lines, to those last words. I feel that structuring the book, however, it's another story. I didn't really have a rule for how I wanted to structure this book, but a friend of mine who's in the audience, Naoko Fujimoto, also a wonderful graphic poet, told me maybe you don't have to have sections in this book, because even though the thread of the book is the loss of your mother and father, there's a thread of loss going through all these poems as you talk about your sons leaving for college, or maybe a beloved pet or a dog, and then also ways the self-portraits and the opposite trajectory of rebuilding the self after losing so much, and after there's been so many holes in your family, in your person, because of all these losses. So yeah, just trusting that they would somehow coagulate, and they did. So yeah, I'm more of a process person than a rule-bound person, I guess. And I feel like the best poetry is written from just trusting the process and going where the image will take you, and mining that and seeing what it is that you thought you that you never knew you knew until you got to the end of the poem.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for those answers. We have a question from Michael Quachon. He says, you mentioned the sacred and ritualistic aspects of poetry. Would you please speak to the spiritual and/or literary lineages that inspire each of you?
I can start. I think a lot about poetry as kind of secular prayers, that we are always trying to name and understand the world through poems, and they even often are shaped like prayers, or the ones that I grew up with. And I also was not from a literary family, if you can't tell from the poems, or a literate family 2 generations back. So this whole idea of the sacred, or language, no, not sacred, but the language, high level language was the only time I ever experienced it was in church. I grew up in church. And so this idea of what the oral tradition of the Catholic Church and the sound of the prayers. I even studied the prayers in Warren Wilson as part of my studies. I wanted to know what this language was. I kept realizing that the ends of my poems had this kind of prayer rhythm to them. And that was I memorized the Mass when I was a kid, and that those patterns of language are deep in me. And so I don't have a poetic spiritual lineage, but I definitely have a language spiritual lineage.
That's interesting. I have pretty much the same background as you, Karen. I grew up with the Roman Catholic Church as the background of my poetic language, I guess, because my parents were both practicing Catholics and they took us to church every Sunday, taught us to memorize, made us memorize the prayers. We said the rosary practically every night, and my parents said the rosary with each other to their last days. I love the Psalms. I love the best part of the Mass for me were the Psalms because the call and response, and really they're poetry, and even the liturgical formulas like order our days in your peace. I thought that was so beautiful, how that just kept coming up week after week, and it shows up in one of my poems. But there is a musicality to the Mass, and there's also a comfort in repetition, which we find in poetry. Incantation, chanting, all of that, spells are repeated because there's power. Words have power. Words make some kind of magic happen, and hearing them aloud even more, and hearing them over and over again, the meaning deepens and gets amplified the more you hear it. And the music somehow, even if it doesn't make sense when you're 7 years old listening to, the Gospel of John, just the music and the repetition convinces you of its authority and its meaning and its profundity. So yeah, it's definitely found its way into my poems. But also, I guess, growing up in the Philippines, we didn't have public libraries, so a lot of the books we read, our school was run by these Belgian nuns, and they stocked our library with books by British authors like Enid Blyton and the twins at Mallory Towers, and they would eat things like scones and treacle pie, which I had no idea what they tasted like, but they sounded so wonderful and amazing. And every time the treacle pie came out, it's like, wow, this must be an important moment. And I even tasted the scone until I came to the US as an adult. But yeah, I feel like my language, someone told me that my language is really, really kind of formal and elevated, especially when I was when I started writing poetry, and I tried to overcome that. But recently at a conference, Gregory Pardlow said, it's whatever you received growing up, that's your language, that's your lexicon. So embrace it. You don't think I'm not Filipino enough in my poetry, or I mean, we didn't have Filipino poets that we could read or that we had access to when we were growing up. And he said that he had been influenced by Robert Louis Stevenson, which his mother read to him A Child's Garden of Verses, I think, every night. And that was part of his lexicon. And you can see also the very Anglo-Saxon and kind of Latin words in his poetry. So yeah, yes, those are my influences.
Wow. Well, similarly, I also I grew up Methodist, so I'm deviant from you all growing up Catholic, but not that far. Also in the South, and so one of the discoveries sort of later in my development was C.D. Wright, and I really felt both the Southern diction and the elevation of that comes from liturgical rhetorics and biblical rhetoric, and that felt like home to me a lot. And I think in this book, in her read, I'm really, picking some fights with particularly the Christian faith in respect to gender and I think of that as Baldwin talks about a lover's quarrel, um, because it's definitely a space, that sacred space feels like a home space to me, but also how home is sometimes turbulent. And I also studied the art of biblical poetry at Warren Wilson. I'm trying to remember the name, the person who wrote that text, Alan something. Anyway, that's escaping me. But yeah, I have looked to try to study this language that I grew up with that was so deeply resonant. And in the Methodist faith, they sing the liturgy. So the song and rhythm and the musicality of words is the primary engine. Often the sonic over the image, the visual image. So that's kind of a go-to, and it does feel sacred. And in the Angelus was speaking of repetition, and sometimes when I was working with the erasure text, repetition was one of the only things I could cling to, because I would see a word repeated and I'm like, okay, I can get some structure from that.
Thank you so much. You have really given us such generous answers to all of the questions. We really loved hearing your work. It was such a moving night, and we could see it was moving for all of you too. I really hope that if you don't have these books, you will find them at your local bookstores or order them from the presses or bookshop.org. We're really happy to have these three poets here tonight. Again, thank you, Jen, for this reading that has been on the books for quite a long time. So it's really wonderful to finally hear all of you. We will let you know when it's on YouTube and you can send it to your contacts. Thank you all for being here tonight. Please join us on February 9th and February 23rd when we have our next incredible poetry readings. On the 9th, it's going to be Richie Hoffman and Michael Terrell and Ananda Lima. And on the 23rd, it's going to be Amatara James and Douglas Kearney and Cindy Beach. So please join us for that. And in March, we have a special month of our new SHP chapbooks. So lots of poetry coming at you from the Hudson Valley Writers Center on Zoom for the next 3 months and in person starting in March. So we're really excited for that. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for your work and for your generosity tonight.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks, Jen, for bringing us together. Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you. So inspiring always to read with you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for this. Have a wonderful night.